I'm Dr. Pretti-Frontczak, and this is an overview of why we continue to struggle to get to a change in practice. So many of us have devoted our lives to supporting adult professionals and getting to a change in practice. And so to get to that change, we know that we have to disrupt the status quo. We have to do things differently, which means we're going to get people outside their comfort zone, and we have to unfreeze the current environment. That's sort of that notion of breaking habits. So I often talk about there being an elephant in the room, and we might not always address the elephant. We might dance with the elephant, dance around the elephant, talk behind the elephant's back, but we don't always face the elephant. And so there's several elephants when it comes to getting to a change in practice that I'm going to walk through and then offer some solutions in terms of why we struggle so much in getting to a change in practice, and why, even if we look at these three things, do people resist disruptions of the status quo, getting outside their comfort zone, or breaking that habit? So we know a few things about professional development. We know a few things about the adult learner. We know that we need to think of them as a whole person. We need to know about their shark music, their things that make them nervous, anxious, worried, as well as the things that bring them joy and what matters most in their lives. We need to give them relief, whether that be emotional or that silly word time, to be able to implement the practices that we see fit or that we see as a necessity. We also know that the content needs to be very much connected to that learner. So they have to, again, see, why does this matter to me? They're very egocentric, as they should be, as far as, does this help something that is a current need that I have? Is it aligned with what I believe or what I think I believe? And maybe that's part of the process, is getting clear on what is it that I really believe versus what have others told me I should believe. And so we really need to think about content as aligning with not just standards or expectations or desired outcomes, but with the learner themselves. And then we just know that in general, people need opportunities for ongoing support. And so we often talk about what's beyond the actual training. And we've talked a lot about coaching, but we haven't really thought about coaching as needing to adhere to the same elements of quality professional development in terms of thinking of the whole learner, as far as making sure it's just in time, that it's in alignment with their beliefs. And we also need to think about job alike or like-minded conversations, so that it's not always an expert with a novice, but that people get to talk to one another about what is working, what isn't working, where are their connections, where are there disruptions in what we're providing. So oftentimes our professional development offers more paradoxes than it does answers. So we've often looked at this image of managing complex change, and I'm going to add two more elements or variables to suggest why change is so difficult to get to, and then I'll offer one more thing that we need to consider. So there's really three things, but we know that we need to have a strong vision. People need skills and incentives and resources, as well as an action plan, which is where we've often come back around full circle in thinking about coaching and ongoing support for when things break down or don't go as expected. But I'm going to argue there's at least two other variables: age and emotional intelligence. That's not to say that we've got it all figured out in terms of vision, skills, incentives, resources, and action plans. There's still much work that we could do there to make sure, especially around incentives, when we think about the adult learner. But for now, let's just take a look at what role does age play and what role does EQ play, knowing that we could break each of these elements down into greater detail and further conversation. So basically, we talk about in early childhood, there's a critical window, or these critical periods, and what we're really saying is that early in development, there's very little physiological effort and the return is great. So the brain is so malleable and placid that great learning and development occurs with, quote unquote, very little physiological effort. The kicker is, the older we get, it's not that our brains are no longer able to be malleable or the plasticity is no longer there. It's just different, meaning we have to have a great amount of physiological effort in order to make a neural connection, in order to either change an existing neural pathway, to reroute a neural pathway, or to establish a new network altogether. And that takes a great deal of physiological effort. So the older we get, the gap is in the wrong direction. So early on, there's this beautiful gap: little effort, great return. Later in life, great effort, little return. So we have to keep that in mind, that as we think about our adult professionals and their age, where do we and how do we design professional development that addresses the need for keeping their systems soothed as they exert more physiological effort, as well as how much do we think of as dosage or repeated interactions to get to the change in practice. And then that brings us to emotional intelligence, which has different definitions, though as you look across researchers and people in this space, there's sort of this notion of awareness, both about myself and about others, this ability to really engage in something that brings us to a common outcome that's desirable for myself and for others. And then this notion of, what do we do with these big, strong emotions? They don't just drop off when we're, turn 3, but we still have big emotions across the lifespan. So how do we deal with those in ourselves and in others? And that's kind of a general overview of emotional intelligence. Another way to think about it is that when we have strong EQ, we are working from our yes brain versus our no brain. So when we think about professional development, we're asking ourselves, am I embedding opportunities to build the yes brain, or am I building the no brain? So the yes brain is balanced, resilient, has insight, and can demonstrate empathy. And so there's this notion of being differentiated and linked, both in my brain and within my community. So balance is this ability to stay sort of regulated, that my pieces and parts are working separately but together. This resilience, that I can move in and out of this window of tolerance into this green zone of optimal learning, and that I have the ability to bring myself in and out of that by building upon my strengths. I also understand myself well, and I can make good decisions. I have great insight, and that comes from having strong emotional intelligence. Lastly, the empathy is back to that differentiated and linked as well. I am my own person, but I am also linked with others in my community, in my agency, in my school district, in my family. Unfortunately, our professional development oftentimes lands us in a place where we are focusing on no brain behaviors. And so then we wonder, why are we getting so much resistance? Why aren't people changing their practice? Well, they are living and growing and being fed, not only in professional development, but in their work and home life, in a place that focuses on rules, standardization, compliance, and fear. Now, there's a necessity to this. There are rules we must follow. There are benefits to having people be on the same page or to reach a fidelity level of implementation. We also have things that we want out of compliance because maybe we know it's best practice for children and families. And then there's always this sort of fear that people will take away funding or take away a rating, or even just our fear that children will not be best served if the providers don't have the skills that we know that they need to have. So these sort of rules, standardization, compliance, and fears pops up either given a state mandate for what we deliver in professional development, or our own fear that I won't cover the right content, or I won't get the people to the right place, and that children and families will suffer in the end. So we have to be careful that we're not operating from a no brain when we're trying to build a yes brain. And so there are 5 elements, as I think, of emotional intelligence. And each of these we can go into greater depth, but we're just sort of thinking about, what do they mean at a surface level? So self-awareness, what are my strengths? What are my triggers? Self-regulation, am I able to stop, think, and then act across different situations? Situational awareness, do I understand what's sort of happening around me? Do I understand what's going to be coming down the pipeline? Do I understand the importance of relationships and group dynamics, or am I just running around putting out fires? Do I have social awareness? This is my ability to meet the needs of other people, their safety, their satisfaction, their need for connection. Am I using good, deep listening and communication skills? Or have I said, I can do that with children, maybe with families, but it's very difficult with my colleagues or people that are resistant to change, then I am not working from my best place because I don't have the ability to meet their needs. And then lastly, spirituality is this place that we are shedding more light than dark, and so that we are moving people to a yes brain, that we are using our connections and our interdependence as a way to connect people with content, connect people with one another, and to always understand that context, while not known, always matters. Okay, so the last thing, if this weren't enough, so we've got this complex mode of change where we have to have vision, we have to have incentives, and so forth and so on. Now we have to worry about the age of people, which we of course cannot change their age, but we can be aware of it. And then we can start to build in emotional intelligence and their strategies to promote people's EQ across all 5 of those elements. But before we get too carried away, we really need to think about, what is it that I'm teaching? What is it that I want as my significant learning outcome? So all too often we jump to the how. How can I get adult learners to be more engaged? How can I get coaching to be more effective? How can I build leadership? How can I use the latest and greatest evidence-based professional development strategies? How can we move beyond training? All these are very slippery slope questions. They're exciting. We want to know, yeah, how do I get people more engaged? How do I be an effective coach? How do I grow leadership? Fabulous questions, but we have to step back and peel back the onion and say what before how, or we'll never get to the desired impact. So if we take something like engagement, well, what is it that you want about engagement? Do you want the significant learning outcome, as Fink would talk about, in terms of learning how to learn, so that the outcome is really that people understand how to use your online collaborative space so that they can be engaged? That's very different from a human dimension of knowing the importance of engagement. Have you thought about, what does it mean to the adult learner? Why would they want to be engaged? How can you free up room in their prefrontal cortex or in their heart or in their calendar to give them an opportunity to be engaged? Or do they feel overwhelmed every time they think about, how will I contribute, or these people sound so much smarter, or I'm so far behind, never mind. So we're really going, that human dimension is the barrier to engagement. Or is it really about foundational skills that they just need to know how to engage? What are the expectations? What are the rules of engagement for engagement? So the what before the how is very necessary before we even think about all these other factors to getting to a change in practice.